Hi, I'm Jody, the mom.
And I'm Dr. Bar the doc, and this is Mom and Doc Talks, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with a special focus on homeopathy. And today, actually, our special focus is on you and you're navigating the process of healing with homeopathy, because it's honestly, it's not for the lighthearted or for the faint of heart. And the rewards at the end are so worth it. Speaking as a person herself who has gone through the healing process and who has come out on the other side, and Jody as a mom who has taken her child through the healing process and come out on the other side. And our next episode is going to be just a big celebration of what that looks like, what life on the other side looks like. And then we're going to get into like the nitty gritty, single issue topics rather than walking through like the journey of what healing looks like. So these next two episodes will wrap up our healing journey, and then we'll just get into like, topics here and there, a la carte, if you will. But it, like I said, it's not an easy journey. And so let's talk through both what it's like with the PANS PTSD, managing those expectations with the ups and downs, managing what response really means, navigating big regressions that come from like teeth issues or emotional traumas, and then like those big drops that can happen from time to time, as well as navigating that what we call the second half of healing, which we didn't really talk a whole lot about in previous episodes. So just to give everybody a quick refresher in case you're picking up here on this particular episode, the healing journey with homeopathy tends to be 2 to 3 steps forward, 1 step back, another 2 to 3 steps forward and 1 step back. So it's a lot of ups and downs. Sometimes you'll take 4 or 5 steps forward, and sometimes you'll take 5 or 6 steps back. And sometimes you'll take a precipitous drop back that can be really hard to navigate because you're always comparing to how things used to be. It's all a part of the healing process because we're stimulating the body's self-healing capacities, and we're getting to a place where the body isn't going to need outside forces to help it heal. And so these are all just part of that process when the body becomes less sensitive to that nudge that you're giving it to heal. And then the second half of healing, we haven't really touched on that a ton, but I think it's important here because that's one of the more challenging parts for parents too. So in the second half of healing, we're getting to the place where a lot of the PANS symptoms are resolved or are resolving, and we're getting into that. I did talk about the pendulum swing. And so it's kind of like when we're in that sort of pendulum swing place, or when we're transitioning into the pendulum swing, where maybe we're having a little bit more blending of typical immune symptoms and neuropsychiatric symptoms, or we're not having as many of the neuropsychiatric symptoms, but there's still like a cyclical pattern that we're seeing where things are maybe just not quite as good as they could be at their peak. And we just have a lot less distance to go to get to that top. So if you have the image where we're trying to go from the bottom of from the parking lot of hiking a mountain to the very peak of hiking a mountain, let's say it's a 2,000-foot mountain that we're trying to hike, or 2,000-foot difference incline that we're trying to navigate. The second half of healing, we're probably in that last 500 to maybe 200 feet where we've done a whole lot of healing, and there's just not as far to go, but the body still is like working out those last little bits. It's harder to navigate because there aren't as many symptoms to have profound change with, because we've gone a far way anyway already. The symptoms are not as clear because it's just little tweaks that we're trying to get at the end. So the symptoms aren't as clear. There's not as much room for change. So that's not going to be as obvious when there's not as much room for change. And it can take a little bit of time. So that can also be a really frustrating aspect for parents in the healing process. And that can be a place where people will sometimes jump off the homeopathy bandwagon and try to seek something else. And I can't tell you how often those people end up coming back because they find that the other things, one, aren't working, or two, that they see more backsliding because they're no longer helping give those nudges, and the body just wasn't done healing yet. So where should we start, Jody?
I feel like almost like if we're talking about post-traumatic stress, like almost back at the beginning, because there's just so many layers. Like before I got to homeopathy, there was so much. There was like being alone in this, having to figure it out for yourself, desperately seeking help, but not getting help from either being completely denied that anything is wrong with your kid, or being given a treatment that has worked and it not worked for your child. Is so incredibly stressful. And then you come into homeopathy And then it's for me, the level of stress did not change. And it's funny because in the last video, I was trying to explain how Avery was doing 2 to 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 to 3 steps forward. I couldn't do it because my own post-traumatic stress wouldn't stop talking. And I couldn't even, like, looking back at her healing journey now, that's how she healed. But my own, like, what I was experiencing was the yes, things got better, but my own post-traumatic stress in the beginning, it was like crazy. I was literally like feeling like I was coming up for air every once in a while and and then going back under. But even in the second half of healing, like you were just talking about, there were like little bits and pieces. Like I remember Avery was having some really a hard time with confidence in school and some of her math skills. And there was like a couple, like 3 or so things that were still hanging in there for a while and hung in there almost until the end. And even though all of the other stuff was gone, I was so focused on those things that were still wrong. And my own post-traumatic stress was still like, oh my gosh, like we're going to live with these things forever. And it's like, this is never going to get better. My life got easier, but my own level of stress stayed the same. And I'm about to go off into another topic here is like, now I recognize this is the importance of moms healing themselves through their children's journey. I didn't do that because I thought I was okay. I thought it was fine. I thought I was handling everything. And in reality, I was just stuffing everything away and had been for many years, if not my whole life. And so now I understand, had I had been going through healing with Avery, that I likely would have been able to move through that second half of healing a little bit better. I think the second half is hard because it just didn't change. Every time something would come back or she would get worse again, it was harder to me because having Avery doing well and life being easy and getting a break from managing all of the things, that felt so good. But then when there was a regression, it felt so bad. It was more difficult for me in the second half because those things coming back was just like earth shattering to me, because it's like, oh, here we go. We're back in it again. We're doing it all over again. And in reality, what we were actually doing wasn't anywhere near as bad as what we were doing in the second half. It was just, it was really hard. And it again, like, helping pull my husband through this. And it was literally pulling, getting him to not, and again, his own post-traumatic stress that he was dealing with, thinking every time anything came back, it's like, this is not working. We're going to do this forever. This is, it's a hard thing to do. And it's even harder once you go longer without, like, because Avery was going through some like really long stretches where she was doing really well, and then things would come back and it just felt just as bad as being in the beginning to me, even though it was way better. It's just such a mind trip that I wasn't equipped to deal with, and I wasn't also healing myself to help me move through things.
It became really apparent to me recently that you have more PTSD still from that than I think either of us maybe recognize, because you are such a beacon of light and strength for the community. When you said off the cuff one time, you said, it's almost like I'm afraid to relax in the good because I don't want it to go away.
Yeah.
And so it's a real thing. And we want to to see you. We want to tell you we get it. We see you as much as we see your kids. We see how this affects you and your whole family. And it's a hard thing. So if you are doing some work with homeopathy for your kiddo and trying to heal them from PANS or PANDAS or some other complex illness, and you're feeling almost more destabilized and more crazy, if you will, than you were while you were dealing with the PANS PANDAS at its worst, or MCAS, whatever complex chronic illness of childhood that you're trying to recover from, you're not alone. This happens to almost everybody, and there is help, whether it's, therapy and, doing some trauma-based therapy or using homeopathy yourself. We've got so many folks that we work with at Resilience. We're focused exclusively on working with kids with PANS and PANDAS, but we recognize that working with kids with PANS and PANDAS means working with the whole family sometimes, because the kiddos are so sensitive to what you are experiencing that sometimes they can't fully heal until you also heal, because they're connected to us, they're tied to us, they know what we're experiencing, they know what we're feeling. And if we're reactive, if we're on alert all the time, they're like, what do I need to be on alert for? What, mom is worried about something, what do I need to be worried about? Like, what's going to happen? What's going to go wrong? So it's a real thing, and homeopathy does help so many families, moms and dads alike, navigate that healing that they need to do to get past this trauma of PANS PANDAS, both like just the impacts on a family, like people losing their livelihoods, people losing their homes, people losing friends and family members over it. I mean, it's a big deal, but you also, nobody goes into parenthood hoping to have the experience of PANS in their future. And like the grief and the trauma that you can have for the different parenting experience. And then also just the grief and trauma for having your child, like you want your child to have the best life ever. And seeing your kid go through it it can be really hard. So
yeah, I think it took Avery getting all the way through. And I know we'll talk about that next time, about what all of that looks like. But it was at the end of her healing journey where I realized that things were starting to happen that were like really good signs, that it was like, okay, we have arrived, we are healed. But I was still having the same responses. Like I was still, a sickness showed up. I think the first big one was strep. And I was like preparing for a hurricane. Like I was getting my mind ready for the fact that we were going back in, and we were going back to battle. And that's just like, things were about to get really, really crummy. And I was like on heightened alert with everything. And the way that I was responding to everything was way, way extra. And it took my husband being like, Jody, like, chill out. Like, everything's okay. She's fine. Like, we're a week into this and she's fine. And then a week later, he's like, we're still fine. Like, just relax. And I just couldn't. I was so like amped up and expecting it. And the way that I was responding to it wasn't okay.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed is that the moms who acknowledge and sit with their trauma and their own stress response that they're dealing with, and especially those moms and dads for that matter, who take steps to address it when they recognize it and are taking steps to address it, that navigating expectations and dealing with like the ups and downs and even like a big regression, like even a last hurrah regression, they seem to be more steadfast and stoic in it and able to see it through. I can't help but think that like navigating expectations of the way a remedy is going to work and what the healing journey and the healing process is going to look like, I can't help but think that is so connected to the trauma and the PTSD, and acknowledging and addressing it and giving you the capacity to see this through to the end, rather than saying, I can't do this anymore, because that's stress, right? That's stress that's talking about it. That stress that is seeing things to be like fire engine red, when really it's like a little hint of red, you know? And it's like seeing things as like significantly more pronounced and profound and problematic than they are, because your nervous system is still so ratcheted up, and it needs its own chance to calm down so that it can assess things more appropriately. And I say this also coming from the perspective of somebody who has worked with multiple people in families, and to recognize how frequently a mom will call and say, my kid's doing terribly, I need a change. And it comes to find out that like kiddo's actually still doing pretty well, because I get the completely objective experience, and it's mom who needs an adjustment in her remedy, because mom's nerves are heightened and on edge, and like over responding to things that have been pretty steadfast and steady, or even improving for their kiddo. Mom's just more sensitive to it. So
this is what I love. Like, I'm getting emotional here. This is what I love so much about homeopathy. And I love that it's so, so different, because you knew me well enough to know when I was kind of skewing things because of my own post-traumatic stress, right? Like, I think it's just so important working with a homeopath that understands the entire dynamic of pans and pandas, and is used to working with pans and pandas family, because I think we probably all do it, right? We all get in our own like freaked out, oh my gosh, something's happening, and then we're like way extra blowing something up, or we're having like that in the moment, this is what's happening, something's got to change like right now, and then having you come in and be like, okay, let's talk about it, let's talk about the symptoms, and not like the that was going on when you emailed me. And so I love that. I love that you guys have the ability to get to know us and really our entire family through what's going on, and help us. Like, I think that's such a big part of it is being able to work with somebody that like really understands your family and your own stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. And I think that it can be hard sometimes also to, again, going back to like the gaslighting and the dismissal and everything that people have gotten probably from lots of people in the process of recognizing PANS is happening and getting a diagnosis and moving forward with all the opportunities and options for healing and everything. So it's not something that we take lightly when we see that happening. And we, at least at Resilience Naturopathic, I can't speak for other places, but we really go based off of like the information that we've got, and we try to be very objective about it. And so we can look back and say, well, here's what was happening for your kiddo last month. Here's what's happening now. So this seems to me like things are about the same, but here's what's happening with you, and like really connecting those together. And even still we always try to come from a place of compassion and understand that, like, even if it is something like, even if it's something that you are experiencing as a parent, there is still suffering, and it does still impact your child too, right? So it is possible that even if it's you who has the bigger shift that needs to happen with your healing trajectory, that it's probably still affecting your child too. And the reality is, like, thankfully you had that trust in me that when I said that it wasn't, you didn't take it as something hurtful, and we never mean it as something hurtful, because it's definitely not like the people who had in your past, not directly, but very indirectly, passively accused you of Munchausen by proxy, which happens to so many PANS and PANDAS families. It was coming from a place of like, there is suffering in your system. Here is the most likely place of the suffering in the system. So let's tweak this, and then we can see, because we also don't want to disrupt things by me listening to you, Jody, saying my kid needs a change. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll make a change because you say the kid needs the change. Like, we have to figure out what really needs the change. And if I change something too early, we can actually send things backwards and make the system even more unstable than it already is, versus like tweaking the one thing that most likely needs an adjustment at that point.
Yeah.
And it took time. Like, if I had said something to you like that to you early on, especially if I wasn't working with you yet, like I would never say it to somebody if I wasn't working with them. The most I would say is, I think that this probably, we're reaching that point where where you personally, mom, or you personally, dad, need some help, because you might be the obstacle in this, because you are still suffering, and your suffering deserves attention too. And leave it at that. Because I've had to have those hard conversations sometimes, and at least from our perspective, when we say it, we'd say it from like a loving place, and like a compassionate, caring place, and like a seeing you place, not like a you're the problem. Like for some people it might feel like that, and like we try to walk that line. And I know that a lot of other providers also try to walk that line, and some are more successful than others. Anything else you want to talk about with like the managing the PTSD aspect, and like the expectations after big regressions, that kind of thing? Or shall we shift over to the second half of healing and navigating that? I can talk a little bit about my own personal experience too, about navigating that second half of healing, because it's a bit of a doozy sometimes.
Yeah, I think just again, going back to understanding that our kids' bodies have to work through this healing. That second half, we're not seeing the big, like huge, there was more going on in the first half. And in the second half, it's like, we're slowly wrapping up the process. And so not seeing those big, like rage being gone, like that's a big deal. We didn't have any of that. It was smaller stuff in the second half that we were managing. And so we weren't having those big, like, hallelujah moments where it was like, it was just really slow and steady. And over time, it just kept happening a little bit at a time, as the months would tick by something. And there was so many times where it was like, nothing's happening. This is so frustrating. Like, we are just stuck. We're just like stagnant, doing nothing. But Avery was still responding. She was still responding to her doses. And at the time, that didn't look like anything to me. It looked like we were just running in place. But we were, she was healing during that time. And tying, it's like tying up the shoestrings. And it was so slow. In my mind, and in actual reality, it wasn't that slow. In the grand scheme of things, it just felt slower and less. And then those, the couple of big steps back were super traumatic to me.
I just thought of an analogy. I've never used this one before, so hopefully it works, and hopefully it makes sense to you, Jody. So I'm just going to give it a go. Okay. So if we use an analogy of a glass shattering on the floor, and that's pans, like the glass is fallen out of the cupboard, it is shattered on the floor, and we are trying to pick up the pieces. The first half of healing, we're picking up the big chunk, and we can see it, they're clear, it's obvious. Then we have smaller and smaller pieces that we can pick up with our hands. We can see it easily, pick it up, and we're getting most of the glass up off of the ground, right?
Right.
Then we have to pull out a broom to try and sweep up the little pieces. And then those tiny little pieces that you can't really clearly see, but that if you step on them, they hurt like a mother. And they are just, and it's important because it can cause issues, but like those get, like the smaller and smaller pieces are not as obvious. They're not as obvious to sweep up. They're a little bit harder to sweep up. They're harder to gather, but they still cause distress if they're there. That's kind of where we're in the second half of healing. We've gotten the big pieces that are like clear, obvious, big problems. Like we, get them up out of the way. We're cleaning up the last little bits of shards in the second half of healing. And so it's not as clear, it's not as obvious, even though there is still some distress that occurs as a result of it being present. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. That's exactly what it was.
And as somebody who went through it myself, so the funny thing is, I had all of these insights as somebody who likely had PANS as a child. I could have seen all of these things because I experienced all of them in my healing journey, but I didn't realize that I was experiencing all of them. And I didn't realize that this was more than just me, that this was a pattern that I have now seen with, again, hundreds of kids, maybe even thousands at this point, where beginning really had profound, clear, great changes. For me, my healing journey took about 5 years. So I'm on the longer end, in part because of my age and in part because of like situational stressors that I was going through. Because part of my healing, most of my healing happened while I was in naturopathic medical school, which is a stressful thing, right? So I had that second half of healing where I was needing a change in my remedy every couple of weeks sometimes, and sometimes it did absolutely nothing, and sometimes it did like a little bit, but it didn't seem to stick, and I would feel a little bit better, but then I'm like, oh, here we go again, let me call up my doctor and get an adjustment made. And definitely having times where I felt like, is this really helping? Is this the best I'm going to be? Is this just like it for me? Do I need to look at other things to palliate the symptoms, because is this the max of where I can be? And I had a massive regression too in that 4th year, where I had the biggest episodes, the biggest flare, biggest backslide I've had in my life, and definitely had that thought of, oh my gosh, like you said, Jody, like was this all for nothing? Like how can I be in this, how can I have spent 3 years consistently using this, doing the healing, if it's working the way that it's supposed to work? Why am I having this now? And it was the last hurrah, because for me, it was a year, but within a year of that, I was done and have not had any episodes, regressions, flares, etc., whatever you want to call it, since then. I've had other things like the ups and downs of life, but I have not had like a regression flare episode at all in a decade. And so it's, as somebody who's experienced it, it's also frustrating. Your kids are probably going to feel a little bit of frustration with things too, and like wondering, is this the best that I'm ever going to feel? And if I hadn't stuck with it, I probably wouldn't be where I am, when we're going to talk more about that in our next episode with our what actually healed looks like, and what life after PANS and homeopathy, and like homeopathy's role in that, what that really looks like for both Jody and her family, and then for me. But if I hadn't had my motivations, my reasons for sticking with it, and my stubbornness, I truly believe that I would still be in the thick of it and taking lots of things to try and manage symptoms. And honestly, I wouldn't have my daughter. And so as hard as the second half of healing can be, and managing those ups and downs, it can be definitely worth it. And I share my story openly in greater detail in our Facebook group, but I share it openly in general, because I know that if somebody had told me, like I had to find my own reasons, and I didn't have somebody who was out there in front of me who'd done it first, and who could say, yes, it's hard. Yes, I see this. I know that this is what you're going through, and it gets better. It will take time, but it will get better. If I can help anybody see that and help them dig deep to find their own reason to keep going, so that they can get to the place that they don't have to be worried about what's going to happen, it's worth it. So that's why I share my story. I think we're at a good place to wrap up, because I'm ready to celebrate. What about you, Jody? I'm ready to celebrate. So we are going to see you on the next episode, where we will talk all about what being actually healed looks like, what life after PANS is like for Jody and her family, and for me. And then we'll transition into some more specific topic-based things, including having some guests come on to talk about their experiences or their expertise as it relates to healing PANS and PANDAS. So hopefully we'll see you guys on that next episode, where we are just going to have a big old celebration.
Bye.